We often think of like the church and its structure as being this, age-old kind of like unwavering entity, right? But what if something as like seemingly, traditional as missionary societies actually ended up igniting this like revolutionary change,
Yeah.
not just within the church, but like in how Western Christianity connected with the entire globe.
Yeah.
So in the 19th century, these societies kind of burst onto the scene, and there's this incredible surge of effort to spread their beliefs worldwide, and their impact was, it was massive.
It truly was. When you consider the sheer scale of missionary work in the 19th century, like the number of people involved, the resources invested,
Right.
it's actually quite remarkable how little attention these voluntary societies have been given by scholars, because they really did fundamentally reshape Western Christianity and propel its influence across the world in ways that were simply unimaginable before.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today on the Deep Dive. We're going to be unpacking the origins and its like kind of surprising impact of these missionary societies. And we're drawing on the work of Andrew F. Walls, who's a really leading figure in the study of mission history. Now, you might have a general understanding of missionary work, but we're going to delve deeper and uncover the unexpected ways these societies operated and kind of the challenges they navigated and the truly profound legacy they left behind.
Yeah. Think of it as a journey to understand the historical forces that actually molded the religious landscape that we recognize today. So these weren't just about sending individuals overseas.
Right.
These were about establishing entirely new ways of organizing religious life in action.
Exactly. So our mission today, should you choose to keep listening, and I'm assuming you are, is to understand how these voluntary missionary societies even came to be. Like, why were they necessary in the first place? How did they differ from the established church structures of the time? And what were some of the like truly surprising and far-reaching consequences of their emergence? So we're talking theological debates, shifts in power dynamics, and maybe even like a theological jork or two that you won't see coming.
Yeah, it's fascinating that despite their profound influence, these voluntary societies were somewhat overlooked in broader church history, I guess, for a long time. But to grasp their rise, we need to go back a little further to the late 17th and 18th centuries.
Okay.
When the groundwork was laid,
Yep.
the movement really gained significant momentum throughout the 19th century.
Okay, so it's kind of already starting back then, and then the 19th century is when things really start to explode.
Yeah, exactly.
And then in 1837, this American missionary statesman named Rufus Anderson, he made some really astute observations about this kind of organizational shift within Protestant churches that was aimed at global conversion. And he pointed out that this was actually a relatively new development.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that Anderson identified the key characteristics of these Protestant voluntary societies.
Okay.
He noted that they weren't limited to clergy. They brought together people from all walks of life, all social classes. They were open to anyone who wanted to join, and crucially, they were responsible to their contributors.
Oh, interesting.
The financial supporters. So this wasn't just a minor administrative tweak.
Right.
It was a fundamental reimagining of how Christian action could be organized, bypassing centuries of tradition rooted in hierarchical structures.
Oh, wow.
So, kind of like the early internet disrupting, established media channels.
Right. It wasn't about this top-down hierarchy like many church structures at the time were.
Exactly.
It was rooted in individuals, local churches, congregations kind of freely coming together for this shared purpose. And Anderson really emphasized how this free, open, and responsible structure embracing all kinds of people was really something quite unique to modern times, and particularly to the 19th century.
And if we connect this to the kind of socio-political context of the time, Anderson astutely recognized that these kinds of voluntary associations could really only flourish in places with a certain level of open government and civil liberty. So places where Protestantism had, in a sense, paved the way for these freedoms.
Right.
He even contrasts this with places like Spain or Naples.
Oh, wow.
Where such independent societies would face significant obstacles in forming and operating.
Right.
He highlights, too, the role of improved communication and the growth of international trade.
Oh, interesting.
In facilitating these global efforts.
Okay, so you've got these kind of pieces coming together that are actually allowing this to happen that might not have allowed it to happen at other periods in history.
Precisely.
Okay, so Anderson is really helpful in terms of helping us understand like the structure of this new movement. But what was motivating this shift? Why were these societies forming? What was it that they offered that was so appealing or necessary that wasn't being fulfilled by the existing structures?
That's a really good question. So the earliest of these modern religious societies emerged in London congregations at the end of the 17th century. They were a direct reaction to very powerful preaching that urged people towards a more holy life.
Okay.
So you had these groups of earnest individuals coming together for prayer, for scripture study, and also to actively address social issues like poverty and public morality, trying to, quote-unquote, reform manners, as they put it.
Reform manners.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? I mean, these independent gatherings often face suspicion, even outright hostility. People questioned why these meetings were necessary, implying that regular church services weren't enough. And I can only imagine in that era, any kind of separate gathering could easily be seen through a political lens, as potential disaffection or disagreement with the established order.
That's a crucial point. The political climate of the time meant that any kind of independent assembly could be viewed with suspicion.
Yeah.
Potentially linked to political dissent or religious discontent.
Makes sense.
However, despite this initial resistance, these societies, for mutual support and the more effective spread of Christian teaching, continued to grow. They were, as we know, incredibly important in the spiritual development of John Wesley and the rise of Methodism.
Okay. So we've got these kind of grassroots efforts happening, and then alongside them, you also had the established Church of England societies like the SPCK, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. But these weren't quite the same as the new voluntary societies, were they?
That's right. The SPCK and the SPG held parliamentary charters, and their leadership was very closely tied to the Church of England bishops. So this meant their focus initially tended to align with what the church had historically done. Things like ordaining and supporting clergy. They did send clergy abroad, particularly to the Americas.
Right.
But their primary concern was often with English colonists.
Okay.
Addressing issues like Presbyterianism or perceived moral failings. The broader vision of global missionary outreach really didn't take hold until the 19th century. So
it was a little bit more kind of inward focused still on the
very much tied to
established order of the church.
Exactly.
Okay. And this brings us to William Carey, a name that's synonymous with modern missions.
Yes.
And his 1792 pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens, was a real turning point. The title itself speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does. The key phrase there is the obligation to use means.
Use means.
Carey's inquiry wasn't just a theological treatise. It combined theology, historical analysis, and even demographic information. But at its core was this fundamental idea that Christians have a responsibility to actively seek out and utilize the appropriate instruments to fulfill the task of spreading the gospel that God has given them.
So he's laying out this obligation, and then what does he say we should do?
So the very first thing that Carey emphasizes is united prayer.
Prayer.
Okay. Now what's fascinating here is that Carey was writing within a context of a growing movement for regular concerted prayer.
Oh, okay.
And this had been significantly influenced by Jonathan Edwards' earlier call for concerted prayer decades before.
Oh, so this concert of prayer was like a significant movement in its own right, not just a...
Absolutely. It was a major
trend.
A major force.
Okay.
And Edwards himself was inspired by prayer meetings that had sprung up in Scotland. And Carey saw this united prayer as a powerful tool, believing that the most significant acts of God's grace historically had come in response to prayer, and that the anticipated global outpouring of the Holy Spirit would also be bestowed in this way.
So he sees prayer as being this really fundamental thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. He even points to the positive developments that he'd seen within his own Baptist circles. Since they started having regular monthly prayer meetings,
that's right,
he sees church growth and clearer theological understanding as, at least in part, answers to those prayers. And it's interesting that he doesn't really differentiate between local and overseas missions in those prayers. It's all about the expansion of Christ's kingdom.
Yeah, and he goes further, connecting these local prayer efforts to much larger global events.
Oh, wow.
So he saw the spread of civil and religious liberty,
yes,
the weakening of perceived popery in the French Revolution, though that was a controversial view, of course.
Right, of course.
And the early moves to abolish the slave trade, including the establishment of Sierra Leone, as evidence of God at work, potentially even in response to prayer.
That's quite a statement he's making.
It is.
To link those small prayer meetings in his, Baptist circle with these major shifts in the world order.
Yeah.
He truly believed that God was working on both levels.
Yeah.
But he doesn't stop at prayer, does he? He argues that prayer alone is not enough and that action, those means have to follow.
Precisely. And this is where he draws a really compelling analogy from the contemporary commercial world.
Okay.
He says, look at a trading company. When they get their charter, they don't just sit around and pray for success. They meticulously plan. They carefully select their resources, their ships, their crews, their goods. They gather intelligence, they take calculated risks, and they invest heavily in their enterprise because they're focused on achieving their goal. And then Carey asks, shouldn't Christians show that same level of dedication and strategic thinking when it comes to the expansion of Christ's kingdom?
Right. It's an interesting question.
Isn't our interest even greater?
So out of this analogy comes his specific proposal, the formation of a missionary society.
That's right.
And he envisioned a company of serious Christians, ministers, and lay people coming together with a clear set of rules and a defined plan.
Yes.
They would select and prepare missionaries, figure out how to fund the work, establish a committee to gather information, much like a board of directors for a business venture.
Exactly.
And, you know, it's easy for us to take this kind of organizational structure for granted today. But back then, this idea of Christians organizing beyond their local parish for a global mission was pretty revolutionary.
It was a fundamental shift in thinking.
Yeah.
Most Christians at that time operated within the confines of their local parish or congregation.
Okay.
Carey's proposal was for a voluntary association of committed individuals uniting for a specific outward-focused purpose.
And you see this same pragmatic approach in the origins of other early societies, like the Church Missionary Society, formed by Anglican evangelicals, and the London Missionary Society, which brought together English dissenters and Scottish initiatives.
Yeah, the underlying realization was the same. The existing church structures in their current form simply weren't equipped to effectively undertake missions on a global scale.
Right. They needed some other kind of way to get this done.
Yeah, Christians needed to actively use means to make it happen.
Okay, so these societies are springing up out of a practical need, almost like a let's figure out how to get this done mentality.
Yes.
But you mentioned earlier something about a theological joke.
Yeah.
What's the punchline there?
The theological joke, as Walls playfully puts it, is that there wasn't really a pre-existing, well-developed theology of the voluntary society.
Okay.
These incredibly impactful organizations arose in a very pragmatic way, often in the face of opposition from those who held to very strict theological and ecclesiastical principles.
Okay, so the rules and the structures of the church.
Exactly. The rules and structures of the church.
So can you give us an example of that opposition? You mentioned an anecdote about an elder Ryland.
Yes, the story goes, though it might be apocryphal, it really illustrates the prevailing sentiment that when Carey was advocating for missionary action, the elder Ryland supposedly rebuked him, saying something like, "Young man, sit down when God wants to convert the heathens. He'll do it without your help or mine." Ryland was voicing a common Protestant theological argument that had been developed a century earlier as a defense against Catholic missionary claims.
So how did that argument go? Was it that the command to go into all the world was specifically given to the apostles, and since the apostolic office ended with them?
Exactly. The argument was that taking it upon oneself to fulfill that command now would be presumptuous.
Yeah.
Almost like claiming to be an apostle oneself.
Right.
The very error they accused the Pope of.
Oh, wow. Okay. But then was there really no, like, theological argument in favor of missions at the time? Was it just a vacuum?
Well, Carey Ever, the logical thinker, quickly pointed out the absurdity of this. He famously asked his fellow Baptists, well, then where was the justification for baptizing? Isn't that equally an apostolic office?
Oh, good point.
His point was that if you take that line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, many core Christian practices would be undermined.
Okay. So even within the Church Missionary Society, there were similar tensions, weren't there? With some worrying about staying true to Anglican doctrine, while others saw these new efforts as a distraction from other concerns.
Precisely. Some within the CMS feared that on the mission field, away from the direct oversight of the established church, there might be deviations from the Anglican prayer book.
Okay.
Meanwhile, many Irish churchmen saw the whole missionary endeavor as a diversion from what they considered the more pressing issue of combating Catholicism.
So they're worried about this kind of spread of something they see as a little bit heretical, maybe.
Exactly.
Okay. So even though they weren't born out of a specific theological framework, these voluntary societies ended up having some pretty significant theological implications.
Yes.
Simply by succeeding in areas where the traditional church structures seemed to lack the necessary mechanisms.
That's a key insight. These classical forms of church government, Episcopal.
So led by bishops.
Led by bishops, Presbyterian governed by elders. Congregational authority rests with the local congregation and connectional form, where local churches are connected within a wider network. In their 18th century iterations, simply weren't designed or equipped to handle the task of global evangelization.
Okay.
These structures were deeply ingrained, seen as divinely ordained by many, and had been the subject of intense debate and even conflict for centuries.
Yeah, you mentioned they seemed fixed and immutable. It's hard to imagine that level of rigidity now.
Yeah.
But back then, those distinctions were so important.
Absolutely. People had invested so much in these forms of church governance, even to the point of bloodshed.
Wow.
And then suddenly it became clear that there were these massive tasks, like reaching the unreached around the world, that these seemingly perfect systems couldn't adequately address.
Right.
And this realization, in a way, forced a loosening of some of those rigid theological viewpoints.
So they're kind of forced to reconsider things?
Exactly.
Okay, and Carey, despite his own Baptist convictions, kind of pretty ecumenical vision, didn't he?
He did.
He advocated for denominational missions initially, but not out of a sense of exclusion.
That's right. Carey's rationale for starting a Baptist mission was primarily pragmatic. He believed that in the divided state of Christendom at the time, it would be more effective for denominations to work separately,
Okay.
building on existing cohesion and trust within their own groups. However, his heart was truly ecumenical. He deeply desired for all who loved Christ to be involved in some way. He saw it as a temporary necessity, not a theological imperative.
So that's quite different from the founding of the London Missionary Society,
Yes.
which explicitly aimed for a non-denominational structure.
Yes.
Right from the start, trying to unite Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregationalists.
Exactly.
And there's that wonderful quote about attending the funeral of bigotry.
That's a beautiful quote.
It really captures the spirit of the founding of the LMS.
Yeah.
Okay, so the aim is to create this common platform for action transcending denominational divides for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah.
And their fundamental principle was very clear. They weren't there to spread any particular form of church governance, but rather the core message of the gospel itself, leaving it to the converts to determine their own church structures.
Based on their understanding of Scripture.
Though, as Walls points out, you could argue that even that principle leaving church governance to the converts subtly leans towards a congregationalist viewpoint.
Yes, that's true.
But the bigger picture is that the LMS demonstrated something truly groundbreaking, that different denominations could actually work together towards a common goal.
Exactly. The LMS became a vehicle for this ecumenical spirit that was beginning to emerge. It wasn't the origin of that spirit, but it provided a crucial outlet for it, a way for people from very different church backgrounds to collaborate in a way that had been practically impossible before.
But this whole thing kind of poses this more fundamental challenge to the traditional church structures, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, they're essentially fulfilling a core function of the church, spreading the gospel, but operating entirely outside the established parish and congregational systems.
That's the crux of it. These missionary societies weren't parishes or congregations in the traditional sense.
Right.
And they operated with a completely different organizational logic. They didn't neatly fit into any of the existing models for how churches were connected and governed, even when the societies themselves were affiliated with a particular denomination. Walls describes it as a new form of church governance growing parasitically alongside the old, attached to these seemingly permanent structures.
Like a vine growing up the side of a building.
Yeah, or imagine, a traditional company where only managers make decisions.
Right.
These societies were like creating independent project teams where anyone with passion and skills could take the lead.
That makes sense.
Sometimes even more effectively than the established management.
Right, and this model of voluntary societies wasn't just limited to overseas missions, was it?
No, it wasn't.
It seemed to proliferate in the 19th century, addressing all sorts of social issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The success and flexibility of the voluntary society model led to its adoption for a wide range of concerns, from tackling specific social injustices to reaching underserved populations within their own countries.
Right.
And the post-1859 revival saw a renewed push to create even more non-denominational structures for both overseas and domestic evangelism.
Okay, so this is really having a huge impact on the way the church is being done, and not just in terms of these, big theological ideas,
Yeah.
but on the ground in terms of how things are actually happening.
Absolutely. It had very real consequences, particularly in terms of who got involved.
Now, one of the points that Rufus Anderson made that you mentioned earlier was that these voluntary societies weren't restricted to just ecclesiastics.
Right.
And this must have had a pretty significant impact on the power dynamics
Yeah.
within the church.
It was a fundamental shift. For the first time, lay people, those who didn't hold official positions within the church or the state, gained real influence beyond their local parish or congregation. As these societies grew, individuals, both clergy and lay, who might have been relatively insignificant within their own churches, rose to positions of immense influence within the society.
You used the Church Missionary Society as an example of this,
Yes.
highlighting how its founders were, in their own words, clerical nobodies.
Exactly. The initial group behind the CMS was a handful of relatively unknown London ministers, a Cambridge fellow, some rural clergy, none of them bishops, deans, or archdeacons. Their main strength in terms of influence came from the support of some prominent lay figures like William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton, whose social standing and political connections provided crucial weight and resources. Famously, when they needed to approach the Archbishop of Canterbury, it was Wilberforce, the layman, who had to do it because none of the clergy involved had sufficient standing.
That really puts it into perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
That these lay people were wielding a level of influence that the traditional church leadership didn't necessarily possess.
Yeah.
In these new organizational structures.
Yeah. And if you look at someone like Henry Venn, who served as the secretary of the CMS for 3 decades, it raises the question of who truly held more episcope.
So by episcope, you mean something like overall leadership and direction?
Yeah, exactly. Overall leadership and direction.
Okay.
During that period, Venn, a layman in that role, had a direct impact on countless clergy and the direction of the entire mission movement, arguably far more than many bishops of the time. And he wasn't the only layperson in such a pivotal leadership position. Figures like Dandison Coates also played crucial roles as lay secretaries.
And it wasn't just laymen who saw new avenues for leadership, was it? You mentioned the increasing role of medical professionals and other specialists, as well as the significant and early leadership opportunities for women.
Absolutely. As the 19th century progressed, you saw medical missionaries and other specialists taking on executive roles within these societies, positions that were previously almost exclusively held by ministers. And perhaps even more significantly, women found opportunities for leadership and organization in these societies much earlier than they did in most other areas of life. Figures like Mrs. Grattan Guinness and Miss Pym of the Leprosy Mission weren't just figureheads or donors. They were dynamic animators, motivators, and organizers who played crucial roles in the success of these ventures.
So these voluntary societies really did usher in this quiet revolution in terms of church structure and leadership, bypassing those traditional barriers that had long limited the involvement of lay people and particularly women.
Exactly, because these societies operated somewhat independently of the established church structures.
Right.
They weren't bound by the same rules and expectations, creating new spaces for participation and leadership that had previously been unavailable.
And you also mentioned how important the local level was. Anderson highlighted how these voluntary societies embraced the masses of the people, emphasizing the importance of regular participation at the local level. So how did that work in practice?
This was absolutely vital to their success. While Carey's initial efforts were based on a small, close-knit group, even larger organizations like the London Missionary Society relied on committed local groups for their ongoing support and dynamism. But the Church Missionary Society really exemplifies this. Initially, it was largely a London-based committee of ministers corresponding with like-minded clergy. For the first 15 years, they struggled to find missionary candidates from Britain.
Really?
And relied heavily on German missionaries.
Wow.
But then things started to change around 1814, and that seemed to coincide with the adoption of a new organizational model.
Okay, what was that?
The CMS adopted the model pioneered by the Bible Society, a network of locally organized auxiliary associations. So these local church missionary associations sprang up in cities like Bristol, often with the support of prominent local figures, but also in smaller rural parishes and even among specific groups like the Cambridge Ladies Association.
Wow. So the CMS is transformed from this centralized London committee into this much broader movement that's really rooted in local parish meetings.
Exactly.
And fueled by people eagerly following news from the mission field.
Exactly. The linchpin wasn't just the distant secretary in London anymore, but the local collector in the parish.
Oh, wow.
Going door to door, perhaps, collecting just a penny a week from individuals and promoting the sales of the Missionary Register.
Okay, so these little acts are actually really adding up
Yeah.
to something significant.
They were crucial. This seemingly small act of local fundraising created a real sense of ownership.
Okay.
People of modest means became stakeholders in this overseas work, feeling like they were personally contributing to something significant.
It's almost a feedback loop, isn't it? As
Yeah.
more people became involved locally and learned about the work through the magazines, that in turn inspired more individuals to dedicate their lives to missionary service.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. And you also mentioned this kind of underappreciated role of missionary magazines in all of this. So how did they contribute to the growth and influence of these societies?
The missionary magazines were absolutely crucial. They essentially created a new reading public and played a significant role in shaping public opinion about the world beyond Britain.
Wow.
So this builds on the earlier success of the slave trade abolition movement, which effectively used media to educate and mobilize the public. The missionary societies adopted and expanded on those methods.
So the Missionary Register, launched in 1812, was the first major publication in this area, wasn't it?
Yes, the Missionary Register was a groundbreaking publication. It provided news for missions all over the world, and in a truly ecumenical spirit, it reported on the activities of various missionary agencies, not just one.
Right.
It was widely read across the country, reaching a much broader audience than the more elite journals of the time.
So these magazines are reaching people who had never been regular readers of periodicals before.
Exactly.
Okay, so they weren't just disseminating information, they were actively shaping perceptions.
Yes.
Creating vivid images of far-off lands and the people living there, and really building up public interest and support for the missionary cause.
Precisely. They shaped opinions, developed mental images of these distant lands, and influenced how people understood global issues. Their impact was so significant that they even influenced popular reference books in the 19th century. So the average reader of a missionary magazine often had strong opinions and a surprising level of knowledge about issues like temple taxes in Bengal,
Oh, wow.
the practice of sati in India, the opium trade, or the slave trade. These magazines created a mass readership that was informed and concerned about the world outside their own borders in a way that was likely unprecedented.
You gave a fascinating example of the CMS's involvement in the Egba state of Abeokuta in Africa,
Yeah.
and how the missionary magazines played a role in garnering public support and even influencing British government action.
That's a perfect illustration. When Abeokuta faced a threat from the kingdom of Dahomey and the interest of the slave trade, the CMS used its influence within government. But that influence was amplified by the public awareness and support that had been cultivated through the missionary magazines.
Right.
People across Britain, from government ministers to those donating a single penny a week, were informed about the situation in Abeokuta and cared about its outcome.
Yeah.
It's highly unlikely that most people in Britain at that time would have even heard of Abeokuta
Right.
without the window on the world provided by these publications.
Okay, so it's amazing to think about like the lasting impact of these 19th century voluntary societies. And you briefly touched on this later development of faith missions, like
Yes.
the China Inland Mission.
Yes.
How did they kind of fit into this evolution?
The faith missions of the late 19th century really represent a further evolution of the voluntary society model. They weren't a completely new invention, but rather took some of the underlying principles of the older societies to their logical conclusion, particularly the emphasis on declericalization and providing even broader roles for women. So in some ways, they were a reform movement, going back to what they saw as the core principles, much like earlier monastic reforms within the church.
Okay, so the voluntary society model continues to shape how missionary work is done, pushing boundaries and creating new opportunities.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, Andrew Walls argues that these societies fundamentally changed the Western church forever.
Absolutely. The Western church, after the age of the voluntary society, was never the same.
So while their initial primary goal was the conversion of the heathens, and the theory was that mission would eventually lead to self-sustaining churches in practice, the societies often remained vital sources of ongoing support.
That's right.
And their role expanded beyond just evangelism, didn't it?
It did.
They became educators and voices of conscience on a wide range of social and political issues.
Precisely. They educated both the church and the wider public about global realities. And they increasingly acted as a moral compass, speaking out against injustices and advocating for change.
And perhaps one of the most significant and unforeseen outcomes is this dramatic shift in the demographics of Christianity,
Yeah.
with the majority of Christians now residing in Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
That's the remarkable legacy. The missionary movement, fueled by these voluntary societies, has led to a situation where Christians in the global South now bear the primary responsibility for global evangelization.
Wow.
It's a testament to the success of the movement, even if it took directions that 19th century thinkers might not have fully anticipated.
So this raises some really important questions for us today, doesn't it?
It does.
Re-examining that obligation to use means in a completely changed global context.
Indeed. We need to think critically about the purpose of our means in this new reality. Our traditional one-way giving model still appropriate?
Right.
How can we foster more reciprocal relationships and truly recognize the gifts and contributions of Christians worldwide?
It sounds like Walls is suggesting that the voluntary society, in its 19th century Western form, was a product of a specific historical moment, but one that God providentially used.
Yeah.
He even draws a parallel to earlier forms of voluntary action in Christian history, like monasteries.
Yes.
Yep.
He uses the term sodality, broadening it beyond its specific Catholic usage to refer to any group voluntarily constituted to work together for specific gospel purposes.
Okay.
He suggests that just as monasteries were revolutionary in their time,
Right.
the voluntary societies have had a similarly transformative effect. And he ends with a provocative thought. The sodalities we now need may prove equally disturbing,
Okay.
hinting that the ways Christians organize for mission and ministry will likely continue to evolve in ways that might challenge our current assumptions.
So to wrap things up, we've seen how these seemingly straightforward missionary societies, born out of a practical desire to spread the gospel, ended up having this incredibly wide-ranging and revolutionary impact.
Yeah.
They weren't designed by theologians,
Right.
but they certainly had profound theological consequences.
They did.
They shifted power dynamics within the church,
Yes.
empowering lay people and women in unprecedented ways. They fostered a new era of local engagement and created a powerful new medium for shaping public opinion.
Yes.
Through missionary magazines. And ultimately, they played a crucial role in the global shift of Christianity.
It was truly a fortunate subversion, as Walls titles his work.
Yeah.
These unconventional structures arising out of necessity and pragmatism ultimately served a much larger purpose than perhaps their founders even fully realized.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. As we look at our own time, how are we using means to achieve our shared goals, whether within the church or beyond?
Yeah.
What new sodalities might be emerging in our own interconnected and globalized world? And how might our traditional structures need to adapt to these new realities, just as they did in the 19th century with the rise of these remarkable missionary societies?
It's a vital question to consider. Understanding this historical movement gives us valuable perspective on how faith and action intersect and how new forms of organization can emerge to meet the challenges and opportunities of different eras.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We hope this exploration of missionary societies and their fortunate subversion has given you some new insights into the forces that have shaped the religious landscape we know today.